All right. It's great to see all of you. My name is John Opdyke. I'm the president of Open Primaries. I'm very pleased today to host this virtual conversation with Nevada State Senator Ben Kieckhefer. Ben represents Carson City and parts of Reno, Nevada. He's been in office since 2011 and currently serves on both the Finance and the Economic Development Committees. Prior to being in the state Senate, Ben served as the communications director for Governor Jim Gibbons, as well as the public information officer for the Department of Health and Human Services in Nevada. He's also a former journalist, having worked for both the Reno Gazette-Journal and the Associated Press, covering politics and policy in Nevada. Ben was selected as a fellow of the 2013 class of the Aspen Institute's Rodell Fellowship in Public Leadership. I mention that because a number of Rodell Fellows have been active in open primaries efforts around the country, including in Arizona. He was also recognized by the Builders Association of Northern Nevada as the 2015 Outstanding Public Official. So it's I'm very honored and privileged to welcome Ben. Ben, I have a number of questions for you. Just to set the stage, I have a number of questions, and we're going to open it up to questions from open primaries activists and advocates around the country. To give people a sense of why Ben is here, earlier this year, he introduced a resolution. He filed it with the Secretary of State in Nevada to enact via ballot referendum nonpartisan open top two primaries for Nevada. Step one is filing with the Secretary of State, and then you have to go out and get the signatures and win the campaign. So Ben, you've been in state government now for a decade. You've been involved in a number of issues: economic development, education issues, licensing issues. What are the dynamics in Nevada politics that led you to identify primary reform as something you wanted to put your political capital and your attention to?
I appreciate it, John. And I want to say thank you to everyone who's joined today. I think I saw on the list that my co-chairs on our PAC may very well be on this call as well, and that's Doug Goodman and Sandra Cosgrove. So if you two are listening, thank you for joining us, and I appreciate your support. We've got a sort of a tripartisan group here between, I'm a Republican, and Doug's a nonpartisan, and Sandra's a Democrat, and the three of us are working together on this as we should. So I have found that the primaries continue to be the primary thing that drives people apart, both politically and on policy. Because having served in the legislature now for a decade, I've seen all too often people worried about how an issue is going to be reflected in a primary election and cast a vote based on that reality. Now, look, I believe in the importance of survival in politics, right? That getting in and getting thrown out after one term doesn't mean you're doing very much over the long haul. So survival is important, but surviving at the cost of good policy on an ongoing or regular basis has become a problem. And there are a lot of reasons for it. It's not just primaries, but primaries, I think, are one of the main drivers when it comes to how we're pushing apart. So I have we have term limits in Nevada. We're termed out at 12 years, 3 4-year terms in the Senate. I am in the second half of my final term. I've got 2 years left. I've got one legislative session in 2021. We have biennial sessions in Nevada in odd numbered years. And as I thought about what I could do to potentially make the biggest difference for our state going forward, I thought that a reform of this type would make, if not the most sense, a lot of sense, because it could have, I think, potentially the most lasting impact on improving the quality of the dialogue we have when it comes to public policy in Nevada.
And Ben, you looked at a number of different forms of primary reform. What made you settle on top two?
So there are a couple of things that I particularly like about it. I grew up in Illinois. And I think most people probably know Illinois, you can sort of choose your ballot regardless of political party in a primary, but you're stuck with that ballot no matter what. So you don't always get to vote for the people you want to vote for in primaries. And sometimes you're stuck pulling a ballot just because you wanted to vote for one specific candidate and you don't really care much about anything else.
Right.
Nevada, we have a hard closed primary system. You have to be registered with the party, and then you get to participate in that primary. It locks out nonpartisan voters. So the most, and I will say nonpartisan voters have been growing exponentially in Nevada in recent years. And there are a number of reasons for that. But getting the voice of 1 out of 5 voters in the election that matters most in most cases was really important to me. So incorporating nonpartisan voters into the process was really objective number one. And I think that this is the cleanest and simplest way to do that. And then I know that there are differences of opinion on this subject, but I still personally like having a binary choice in a general election. And the idea that someone is going to be elected with the majority of the vote from the people voting. And that sort of affirmative process gives people a mandate when they walk into office the next day. In Nevada, legislators take office the day following the election. I'd also had experience with the Independent Voter Project in California, and seen and talked to, or at least talked to them about that process and why they like it and how it's turned out in California. I think it's turned out well. So while in Nevada, there's resistance from doing anything that says we're adopting something that they do in California. Right. This is one that makes a lot of sense to me. It's done in other states as well, and it works well in those states. So I think that and maybe equally importantly, and something to point out, I think it's simple for the voters to understand. I'm going to be asking the voters most likely to weigh in on this on a ballot question, and to be able to easily describe the process and its benefits is important.
You mentioned that the number of independent voters has been rising dramatically in Nevada. I think from looking at the stats, it's gone from 15% of the voters just a decade ago to now close to 25%, 23 or 24%. And the numbers go up every year. What's driving that in your sense? What's contributing to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, and you're right. It went from 15% when I took office to now it's almost 23. And when you add in, sort of minor parties, you're getting up to close to 30% of the electorate does not participate in a Republican or Democratic primary election. So Nevada has always been a very sort of libertarian, independent state, and it remains so. So there's always been a lot of sort of more moderate Republicans and more moderate Democrats. One of my colleagues in the state Senate, who's probably one of the more conservative members of the state Senate, really, is Senator Ben Kieckhefer. He lives out in Ely. He's a cattle rancher, and he was elected to the county commission out in Eureka originally, Eureka County as a Democratic county commissioner. So there's just a lot of that in Nevada, and I think the sort of the polarization of the political parties has driven people away. I've got a lot of friends who have given up their registration from both parties, just because they don't want to be associated with a brand that they feel is being detrimental to the cause, and the cause being good government, good politics. And it's been a driving factor of people away from the party. And it's been exacerbated is the wrong word, but it's been accelerated by the implementation of automatic voter registration in Nevada. That was adopted by the legislature last year, and it's been implemented in a manner where the default for voter registrants is nonpartisan. So we've already made it the public policy of the state that we're going to automatically register people as nonpartisans. So when you sit down at the counter at the DMV and you do whatever transaction it is that's going to trigger your automatic voter registration, then you become a nonpartisan voter. They then give you a separate form that you have to fill out separately, walk it across the DMV, put it in another box in order to affirmatively choose a political party of some form. So that is something that is not happening very much. And thousands and thousands of people are being registered nonpartisan by default as the public policy of the state. So as that has accelerated, I think it's going to be a rude awakening for a lot of people who think they're registered to vote, and then come June, they realize they don't get to participate in a primary, when the default position was that was a decision that was made by, frankly, the regulatory body that oversees it.
Got it. That makes sense. We've seen that in other states too that have enacted the automatic voter registration. In Oregon, for example, they did it in 2018, and 67% of all new registrants from 2018 are registering as independent. So it's not surprising it's similar in Nevada. Without taking too much time, Ben, can you describe for us what's involved in enacting this change? Because I know Nevada has a very unique process.
Sure. Well, thank you, John. There were a couple of different avenues we could have gone down, right? What I've introduced is a statutory initiative. This is the public process by which an individual citizen can change Nevada state law. Sorry, I've got background phone ringing. That's coming.
Okay.
So the statutory initiative process in Nevada allows any individual citizen to draft statute and then submit that to the Secretary of State's office, which I have done. That statute then becomes an initiative. So we've actually gone through the initial period by which people could legally challenge some of those provisions. It was a veritable miracle that we did not receive a legal challenge on this, but we didn't in the initial phase, where they can challenge things like single subject rule, which is a constitutional requirement in Nevada, or fiscal impact wasn't challenged either. At any point in the future, someone could potentially challenge a constitutional issue, but that's sort of down the road, and it probably wouldn't happen unless it takes effect. So with a statutory initiative, I filed in January, and the clock ran out, so to speak, on the legal challenge period, and I have now from any time now until November 20th to gather the requisite number of signatures. And in Nevada, that's just under 100,000 signatures spread out across our 4 congressional districts. And if we gather those signatures, get them certified by the Secretary of State, then the initiative goes to the legislature in 2021. And the legislature is required to make a decision within the first 40 days of the legislative session, which begins the first Monday in February. And they can either accept it or reject it or propose an alternative. If they accept it, it just becomes law. If they reject it, it automatically goes to the ballot in 2022. They can't stop that from happening. Or if they propose an alternative, then both issues would go to the ballot in 2022. So the legislature can't stop this from getting to the ballot if we get enough signatures, which is the reason that I really liked it. We could have, and then once we're through that process, if it goes on to the ballot, we have to run a political campaign to get it passed. But that's not until the next election cycle, 2022 cycle. So we could have gone down an alternate path. We could have gone with a constitutional amendment, which has a shorter time frame for collecting signatures. You'd have to have the signatures collected, the same number of signatures, by June rather than November. So this gives us all of that lead out through the summer and early fall, which, considering the current state of things, is an exceptional benefit at this point, because I don't know how you collect signatures with social distancing going on. It just doesn't really happen. So I think we're in a good place, aside from now having to go out and raise money for gathering the signatures. But I'm still hopeful and optimistic that we're going to be able to move forward.
Got it. I think in addition to the social distancing aspects of our current situation, obviously Nevada is a state that relies heavily on hospitality, on tourism, industries that have been really devastated by the current shutdown. You don't have a crystal ball. A lot of things could change and develop. But how are you feeling, given the disruption of COVID-19, about the possibilities of kind of keeping moving forward? Just tell us your current thinking on that.
Yeah, it's my hope had been to have one or two primary seed funders who can write big checks in Nevada, and then go out and piece together the other money that's going to be necessary to sort of push it over the top. And I think the reality probably is that I'll have to try to rely on a few big funders to fund the whole thing. I've got some money that I can put into it from my campaign account. As I said, I'm termed out. I can't run again. So I've got some resources I can commit. I still think there's a pathway forward. How, I rely on paid signature gatherers. I don't think I've ever seen a volunteer signature gathering organization prove successful. So I think it requires the commitment of resources to go out and hire the signature gatherers necessary to get the job done. And I'm still hopeful. Those conversations are ongoing. My primary targets for funding this have not primarily been active casino companies, so that's good because they're bleeding right now. So I'm cautiously optimistic at this point, not as optimistic as I was before, but with the amount of time frame that we have to get the signatures, all the way through November 20th, I think that, I'm certainly planning on pushing ahead. Great.
Okay. All right. Well, let's open it up for questions. So just to remind everybody, the way we're going to do questions is as follows. If you have a question for Ben, just go to the chat thing, which you get to at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Put your name, your state, and then a one-sentence summary of what you want to ask. I'm not going to ask the question for you. I'll then call on you, and you can ask Ben your question. It's just helpful for me to see in advance what the question is in case we have multiple people wanting to ask the same question. So, and then take yourself off mute, ask your question, put yourself back on mute, just so we can avoid background noise. So let's open it up for questions. Okay, our first question is from Joseph Collimer in Washington, D.C. Joseph, take it away. You got to take yourself off mute, Joseph.
Hi, now. It's just a question of fact. So for what offices do you plan to introduce top two runoff? It's local, state, also federal offices, as California or other states did?
Yes, thank you, Joseph. I appreciate that question. I should have clarified. This applied to all races except President of the United States.
Oh, that's great. That's very good. Thank you. Because no, I'm in touch with other people in Florida. We had the other day similar meeting, but they consider local and state offices, but not the federal Congress. So
yeah, it's interesting. Part of how I explain this to people is that this is ultimately converting what we have now as our partisan races to how we operate nonpartisan races. This is exactly how we operate our city council races right now in Nevada. They're nonpartisan offices, and it's a free for all in the primary, and top two go through to the general, and the winner moves on into the office. It's exactly so. So people in Nevada are familiar with this process if you sort of couch it in those terms. And ultimately, we're converting our partisan offices to nonpartisan offices in how we run our elections.
Mm-hmm. Just a clarification, just in case. I'm strongly in favor of top two runoff open primaries, but is anybody around in Nevada considering ranked choice voting or something like other alternatives, or perhaps even approval voting?
Yeah, look, there has been a lot of discussion about the process, right? I modeled this initiative as I have for the reasons that I articulated earlier. There is ongoing discussion about different formats, right? And ranked choice is one that gets a lot of discussion. Actually, in the Democratic caucus for president here in Nevada, they used a ranked choice system for the Democratic caucus, and I think that there's merit in anything. I think that opens things up to nonpartisan voters, which is really my key, to get everyone involved and increase the amount of participation that happens in the primary level, because so many races are decided at the primary. So there are ongoing discussions. We'll see. I haven't seen any efforts at the legislative level as of yet, but I know those discussions continue to happen.
Right, but I think you made a very good point about how top two is easier to understand by the voters. It's very intuitive, and I would say it's also relatively easier to introduce because the primaries already exist. So you need to just open them. RCV is much more complicated because people don't understand. That's a fact. I know a lot about it, and actually it's more difficult to create a totally different system from the existing one.
Yeah, John, I think the biggest challenge I've heard in terms of feedback is for people to understand that we're not letting sort of Democrats vote in the Republican primary, right? Or Republicans vote in the Democratic primary. It's changing the system so that the political parties are no longer, the state is no longer running primaries for the political organizations, right? Which is what it is now. So it's that sort of conceptual change that is going to be probably the biggest hurdle to have people overcome. But when you start explaining it in terms of the way we work our local government elections, it makes a lot more sense to them.
Well, that actually dovetails with our next question, which is from Vilia Johnson in Florida. Go ahead, Vilia.
The open primaries will be on the ballot in November in the state of Florida. And when I talk to people about supporting it, the pushback I get the most from either Republicans or Democrats is that we have the right to choose our own candidate, and we don't want other people voting when we're trying to choose our own candidate. So what do you say to those people?
Yeah, what I say to them is that this is a new way to think about sort of our elections, and we're certainly not telling Republicans what to think, what their platform needs to be. We're not telling Democrats how they need to operate their internal structures. But what I'm saying is that the election system should be about people, not about political parties, right? And we should both empower individual voters to have the authority to make the choice that's most important to them in an election, and we should empower candidates to be able to present themselves to a broader group of the electorate and appeal to a broader group of the electorate if they want to be elected to office. And people don't always like that answer, but I think they at least understand it.
All right, we have another question from Kimmy Cole in Nevada.
Hey, Kimmy.
Hey, I appreciate everybody's time and being invited. So just curious, have you shopped this around with other legislators? And the reason that I ask for that is this question has been something that I've been looking at, working with Doug for a period of time. And what we've seen is there are districts and offices, say, that are in a very heavily majority Democratic area. They don't like to give anything up. And then there's other situations that are in heavily Republican areas. They don't want to give everything up. So there's this taffy pull that says, we're going to hold on to our own and we never come anywhere in the middle. So do you have any sense among other legislators what the appetite may be for this? Is it a good idea that may be coming of time?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Kimmy. I appreciate it. Ironically, I think I based the statutory initiative off a bill that was introduced by your senator. You're represented by Senator Settlemyre, right? Yeah, he introduced this concept in 2017, and the bill didn't even get a hearing. So I modeled it off legislation that was introduced by Senator Settlemyre, and I know that he's still supportive. I've gotten pushback from other Republican colleagues of mine who, thinks it's a terrible idea, and but what I don't have faith in is a group of elected officials to change a system that has worked so well for them. And I've seen it too many times. And I know that people who are successful under the current conditions aren't likely to change them. So I'm not banking on the legislature adopting this. And that's why I went through the statutory process, because I saw 2 times in a row where Senator Settlemyre offered up an idea to move to an more open primary system, that it was shot down without even a hearing. So I think It may be because of the changes in voter registration that people are more willing to talk about it, but a willingness to change it is a whole different story.
Right.
This process is a way for me to force the discussion, right? They can't avoid it if I get the signatures.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All
Ken.
right, we have a question from Bill. Go ahead, Bill. Bill, you got to unmute yourself. There you go.
Yeah, hey, Ben. Thanks for doing this. A quick question. How much, have you raised any money? Do you have any funders in Nevada? How much do you think it'll cost to gather those signatures, particularly in this challenging environment?
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate the question. So I haven't actively raised money yet, right? I was waiting for the expiration of the legal challenge period before I started actively going out and raising money, because the first thing I was worried I was going to have to do was spend, a couple $100,000 on litigation. But thankfully avoided that. And then sort of COVID took over. So overall, budget-wise, I generally bank about $10 per signature in terms of gathering. If I need 100,000, I'd like to get 120,000. So 1.2 million would be a rough estimate of how much I would need. Now that was pre-COVID. So I think that there are signature gathering companies that would be likely to offer some discounts on that per signature price on a go-forward basis, because a lot of their work has dried up. So that's probably top end margin, but I think banking about $1 million is probably right.
Well, I wish you good luck. I think the key is finding one or more passionate, extremely wealthy people in Nevada to spearhead the funding. I mean, California would not have happened without Charles Munger. And I think you have the same, a very similar situation. It's nice for people out of the state. We care about it, but it's going to be very hard to find somebody to take a lead who isn't in Nevada, I would think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I entered this with the assumption that I would have to raise every dollar in Nevada. And, if I have to go out of state to raise the money to do it, that probably doesn't speak well to how much Nevadans really want it. So my plan is still to raise the money that's necessary in state. As I said, I've probably got a couple 100,000 that I can piece together to start it if I have to, but a couple of $500,000 checks from some of my constituents would go a long way. And look, as I said, or I think part of my district that John failed to mention was that I also represent the North Shore of Lake Tahoe. So I've got some constituents who can certainly have those kinds of resources.
Yeah, you've got to get them in the loop, because the election fight, and the woman from Florida kind of brought it up. I mean, you're going to be going against both political parties that like the current system, and it's going to take a whole lot of money. By the way, the woman in Florida, to me, it's a question of if you like pragmatism and bipartisanship, you're in favor of this. If you like extremism, if you're the hard right or the hard left, and it's my way or the highway, you're going to fight this to the hilt. Fortunately, most general election voters are not in that camp. It's a tough fight.
One question, I have a number of questions I want to get to here, but just one thing while we're on this subject then. Have you given thought to kind of creating a hybrid model for petition gathering that kind of combines paid petitioners with a volunteer operation? Something that's done. I know Doug and others have been kind of building volunteer networks throughout the state for a while. You thought about that?
Yeah, look, I certainly would never turn away a volunteer, right? And I think that especially with something like this, you'd be able to assemble a good number of people who could volunteer on at least a semi-regular basis and help the cause. I would feel uncomfortable relying on such a structure to try to execute the full number of signatures that's necessary. But certainly I will welcome and put all volunteers to work.
Got it. All right, we have a question from Harry Kresge in New York. Harry, Ben, by the way, Harry Kresge is one of the most accomplished election law attorneys in the country. Which doesn't mean he's good at unmuting his phone.
Okay.
Hi, Harry.
Am I unmuted?
Yep, you're fine. We're good.
Thanks. Hi. Well, this sounds very exciting, and I just wanted to take your pulse on an issue that some of us who've been involved in this fight are working towards as well, which is that it's improper and in some states unconstitutional, and maybe unconstitutional under the federal constitution as well, for the state to be paying for the primaries of the parties, particularly since the parties now identify themselves more and more as private organizations. And just wondering what you think about that as an alternative approach, not to deny the importance of what you're doing.
Let me make sure I understand your question. Are you suggesting that we could potentially legally overturn the existing primary structure because of the funding issue?
Yes.
Okay.
Many states have what are called anti-donation clauses in their constitution, for example, saying the government money can't be spent on private associations.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I work for a law firm and we do a lot of election law, but I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to pretend to be. It's an interesting concept, though. God, there's just so much history and precedent of actually doing it, that the idea that a Supreme Court would say, no, you're no longer allowed to, even though it was created this way from sort of the earliest days of elections. Look, you would know better than me, but I haven't heard about a challenge on that front. I think that the argument to make to people to say the government shouldn't be running elections for private organizations makes a lot of sense. When I relate it to other private organizations, non-political ones, they would say, no, we would never want to get involved in that. So there's certainly crossover, and I think the people get it for the most part if they're inclined to support something like this.
And it's certainly an argument in support of top two and the kind of system that you're implementing, because the state is not funding something that's special to the parties.
Exactly. And frankly, if the state is funding something, funding an election, every taxpayer should be able to participate.
Exactly.
I just think that makes basic sense to everyone. If I'm using taxpayer dollars to fund an election process, then everyone should be allowed to participate in it, and we shouldn't be shutting people out. They shouldn't have to join a private club in order to access an election system that the government is creating and funding.
You got it.
I got there eventually.
Thank you.
Ben, going back to something that Bill Bloomfield in California mentioned, and Bill, for those of you who don't know, is a veteran of the 2010 campaign to enact the top two in California. And he's been a big proponent of political reform in California and around the country. Both political parties are threatened by the top two system. And we know this in Oregon, in South Dakota, in California, in Arizona, that they are very threatened by it. They don't just oppose it kind of intellectually, they bring out the big guns, they campaign against it. You mentioned at the beginning of the call that your PAC is made up of yourself, a Republican, a Democrat, an independent. You're clearly thinking about how do you build a kind of a multi-ideological, multi-partisan coalition necessary to stand up to the abuse that you're going to take. Mm-hmm. Tell us how you think about kind of growing that coalition, or what's, how do you approach kind of bringing together people from the left, the right, independents, partisans, to create something?
Yeah, it's an important question, right? And I appreciate it. I've always tried to be the person who looks for sort of bipartisan sponsors for my bills, right? For bicameral sponsors for my bills, to try to build those coalitions that are going to be necessary to be successful in whatever avenue I'm going down. And that those co-sponsors, for example, change depending on the subject matter that I'm dealing with, or whatever it might be. So the strategic partnerships that are necessary to be successful in a political environment are probably all the more important here, because of the intensity with which the spotlight's going to shine. So, for those of you who don't know, Sandra Cosgrove, who's the co-sponsor, is the Nevada, and I apologize, Sandra, if I get the title wrong, president of the League of Women Voters.
The League of Women Voters of Nevada.
There we go. Thank you.
Good.
So we're a good government group.
Yes, absolutely. And, Doug Goodman runs a nonprofit, or I don't know if it's officially a nonprofit, but it's Nevadans for Election Reform. And it's been targeting reforms to, and he's been highlighting the need for reforms that bring nonpartisan voters into the electoral process. So we've got, I think, some high-profile leading advocates in this space already engaged. And I think that while it may, I don't want to say it's easy, but it may be easier for Doug from a nonpartisan perspective, Sandra being, sort of a well-known Democrat, and myself being a well-known Republican, have a little bit more exposure on our flanks, that I think both of us are sort of willing to deal with as at the tip of the spear. And as you're able to do that, I think you're able to shelter those below you a little bit who are willing to join and help. So I've got, I know I've got support from both conservative and sort of moderate flanks of the Republican Party. And there's going to be a strong coalition building process that goes into this. I've talked to a lot of our nonpartisan mayors and other government officials that are unhappy about the state as it currently is and are willing to join this coalition. So I think getting other popular elected officials of all political stripes and with no political stripe will be the first step in building the umbrella that really shelters people from the tomatoes and rotten fruit that's going to fall on them.
Got it. Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's
sort of how I see it.
I mean, yeah, no, that's very helpful. I have a question from Jared Applewhite, who asked that I asked the question because his mic is disabled. So the question from Jared is, did you consider top 4 as an alternative to the top 2 format? It's a mechanism that ensures that the general election will not be dominated by 2 candidates from the same major party.
I didn't, and a couple of reasons. First is that, as I sort of indicated earlier, I like I have comfort in knowing that someone is going to be elected with the majority of the votes. I like that process, and frankly, the idea that 2 candidates of the same party are going to get into the general election doesn't particularly bother me. In districts that are heavily populated by one party or the other, maybe that's the best case scenario, and maybe that's the best way to have people of a third party, a minor party, or a nonpartisan voter. Maybe that's the best way to give them a say in who represents them in their government, and they can choose. If the district was going to be represented by one party anyway, based on an overwhelming registration advantage, then having 2 people of that party in the general election gives voters an opportunity to have more of an influence, I think, if they're not registered with that party. If that makes sense.
Got it. Okay. Couple more questions. Just one for me, though. You mentioned, Ben, that mayors in Nevada are elected in a nonpartisan system. Is that true, like in every city in Nevada already?
I believe it is.
Yeah.
I believe that all mayors are elected nonpartisan, and city councils are nonpartisan. Our county commissions are elected on a partisan basis.
Got it. Okay. We have a question from Nancy Hanks in Pennsylvania.
Hi, thank you, John. Thank Senator Kieckhefer for doing this.
And just stick with Ben, please.
I'm sorry. Okay, Ben. So I thought it was so interesting. I work with independent Pennsylvanians, and we had a similar, I think, issue from what I was hearing. We have a piece of legislation in the state legislature that would open the primaries to, it would be nonpartisan primary, so independents could vote. It's stuck in the legislature, and it was what interested. I think it could be that I think Mike Christmas is on the phone. I'm not sure, but we. I was so struck by what you were saying that the move to voter register motor voter registration was. It seems striking that so many people decided to get out of the party system and just register to vote. So how are you using that? How are you feeling about, doesn't that give you strength in this process, and how do you capture that from the grassroots?
Yeah, well, it certainly does give strength because the numbers are surging, right? And the number of nonpartisan voters are growing by the day. Well, maybe not today with the DMV closed, but up until the time the DMV was staying open, the numbers were just growing exponentially. So, I mean, from a political perspective, you have an automatic target list, right, of signatures that you need, and DMVs become even better places to go out and gather signatures than they were prior to this. And I think that if I don't think that people fully understand that they're being registered under as a voter who can't participate in primaries. You know, I don't think they get that, and when that's explained to them, they get pissed off, as they should. And that makes them certainly more likely to sign an initiative.
All right, we have two more questions, both out of California. The first is from Professor Christian Gross. Ben, Christian is a professor of political science at USC and has done, I think, more research than anybody in the country on the impact of primary systems on elected official behavior. So Christian, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, John. Yeah, my question was more about the ballot signatures, and I was curious if there's any election reform efforts in the state around COVID to have emergency measures for online access, and perhaps something could be done to encourage online or virtual ballot signatures just in an emergency period that might make it easier for you to collect signatures over the next several months.
Wow, nothing on the signature gathering front. Our secretary, yes.
Yes, there actually is.
On the signature gathering?
Yeah, because we're doing the ballot question to amend the Constitution. So our deadline is June 24th. Mm-hmm. So we have asked the Secretary of State if she could do some emergency regulations to allow us to gather signatures electronically through the voter registration online system. We're still waiting to hear back.
Okay, so yeah, I hadn't heard about anything, but I didn't know that was in process. The Secretary of State has changed our primary to an all-male primary system. So that is a first for Nevada based on the pandemic. So we're going through significant changes right now. There's discussion about that. There's some efforts to make some changes to the regulations as they've been outlined. And so we're in a moment of change, and Sandra, I'll follow up with you on whether we're allowed to do some signature gathering virtually, because that would be incredibly helpful as well. If there are, Christian, if you have examples of other states where this is allowed or where something has happened, I'd love to circle back with you and get examples of what's been published in other states that allows this, because that could be certainly helpful for us. Sandra, if you don't have all of those examples already, you may very well through the League of Women Voters Network.
Yeah, I have heard of some efforts elsewhere that I'll can discuss offline.
Okay, thank you.
Massachusetts has a lawsuit underway.
There's a lawsuit underway, Hank, is that what you said? Or Harry?
Issue.
Okay.
Yeah, so Ben, Josh, and Adam in the law firm where you work have been following this. So they've got
Yeah.
the information.
Okay. My friends, shows you what I know.
Small world. Okay.
My friends and lawyers.
Final question. We're going back to Bill Bloomfield in California. Bill.
Ben, quick question. In California, I don't believe we'd have open primaries if the first initiative had included included Congress. I'm wondering if you've considered only doing the legislature. I think dividing and conquering is easier. Charles Munger told me when I asked him back in 2010 why just the legislature, he said, because I didn't want to take on the state and national Democratic Party, and he believed that Nancy Pelosi would single-handedly kill it. I'm wondering if you considered that.
Yeah, look, I don't I think it's a good point, and you know, it may just be that we have such a smaller federal delegation in Nevada than in California that I haven't worried about it as much. You know, but the threat of Nancy Pelosi killing something in Nevada, in California, still has the sounds of the threat of Harry Reid killing something in Nevada, which is, you know, still potentially possible. He's still a well-respected figure here. So, you know, the reason I left out presidential was because we're a caucus state, right? So parties run their own nominating processes for president, but the state runs everything else. And I liked the purity of including all races in it. But, you know, the consideration that the national parties are going to get engaged certainly could have an impact in the actual, you know, campaigning for or against in 22. I see that. It's a good point.
All right, we've reached the end of our call. Time flies. Thank you all, everyone, for joining. Just a quick announcement. We're going to be doing these Zoom discussions every 2 to 3 weeks. Our next one is going to be actually with attorneys Harry Kresge, Jeremy Gruber, and Michael Hardy, who are going to brief people on some legal, political developments in the primary reform arena. We have lots of other things planned, so, you know, stay tuned in your email box, and we'll see you on the next one that we do in early May. Ben, do you have any final thoughts or comments you'd like to share before we sign off?
Just a big thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to you, John, to come on and sort of present what we're doing out here in Nevada. But most importantly, thank you to all of you for your efforts to, you know, give more people access to their government. I think that's what this boils down to, and giving more people the power to make decisions about who represents them is something we should try to focus on and be proud of doing. And I'm sure you all are, and I'm happy to be joining your team. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Take care.